Welcome to Hot Talk. This is Hot Talk from Cal Poly, the California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, and it is a transmission of WorldLink TV. And today we're recording from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and I have in studio with me a very special guest, Phyllis Bennis, who has a brand new book about to come out, and it's a book, by the way, I'm going to recommend, not having read it because I've read so much that Phyllis Bennis has written. It's called Before and After the United States Foreign Policy and the September 11th Crisis, published by Interlink Publishing. All right, Phyllis Bennis, I'm looking forward to reading this book, but since I haven't yet read it, give me a brief description, Before and After, U.S. Foreign Policy and the September 11th Crisis.
Well, it deals essentially with the question of unilateralism. That's something that we've been hearing a lot about since September 11, but it's actually something that was existing as the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy, certainly under the Bush administration, even before September 11. And in fact, even the Clinton administration, even though they claimed to be great multilateralists, in fact operated off a pretty unilateralist approach to things anyway. So what I talk about in the book is sort of what's changed, what's different, and why is it important.
And?
Well, what's changed is that things are a lot more unilateral than they used to be. The unilateralism has gotten worse. And one of the things that's, I think, really important is that one of the big differences between this administration and the last one is that these guys are really proud of it. You know, under Clinton, there was a lot of unilateral moves. They refused to pay dues to the United Nations, refused to support the International Criminal Court, refused to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There's a whole host of examples, you know, there's a litany of them. But it was all done in the name of coalitions, in the name of multilateral action, the United Nations. There was a lot of rhetoric. The Bush administration comes in and says, we're unilateralists and we're proud. We like it this way, you know. I mean, we shouldn't forget, this was the guy who came in, very young president, and his advisors, all of them more experienced than he was, were sort of proud of the fact that he didn't have any frequent flyer miles. You know, this was a Congress at the same time, half of whom didn't even have a passport, you know, where the whole question of the U.S. role in the world, who we are, where we fit, what it means to be the biggest and strongest country around, sort of wasn't on anybody's agenda anymore. We were the biggest and toughest kid on the block, so we're going to say what goes, and that's what will go. And I think that's been a very damaging thing in the United States. It's different, it's worse in practice, but it's also a lot worse in rhetoric and in language and in discourse. So when you hear people in high positions of power, like the president, saying stuff like, yeah, we should just do whatever we want because we're the strongest country around, and everybody else will come along because, frankly, they don't have a whole lot of choice. That's a really bad thing for how we're educating children, for one thing.
Well, you know, the old adage that history repeats itself, first is tragedy and then again is farce.
Right.
And you recall back in, well, you don't recall it from memory, but from your history books, back in 1920, when Woodrow Wilson essentially said, we are the great power now in the world, and we have to lead a coalition of nations, and we'll call it the League of Nations.
Right.
And he proposed that the United States join with mainly the European powers in essentially establishing a world order, to put down revolution or disobedience, whatever you want to call it. And he said, this is the way to go. We would be kind of the primus inter pares, right? The kind of senior partner. And Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the Republican senator at that time from Massachusetts, rose, and he said, well, yeah, I agree. We are the strongest and most powerful, and we ought to take what we want in the world, but I don't see why we have to share or we have to have any partnership.
Right.
And this was the debate over the League of Nations. And ironically, at the time, the Congress, neither side really had the majority. There were six votes in the Senate that proved crucial, and these were the so-called progressives. And they voted to kill the League of Nations,
Right.
but on grounds that few members of Congress today would pick up. They said, you can't have an empire and a republic. And if you're going to have a republic, we have to eschew empire.
Well, you know, there's some similarities today. Although they don't use the same language, nobody quite admits it's an empire. But what we really have is the setting up of two different kinds of international laws. The U.S. will say, for the rest of the world, we need international law. That could mean, for example, we need an international criminal court. Never again should anyone who is guilty of genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes be allowed to go free because there's no jurisdiction to try them. We need a prohibition on anti-personnel landmines. That was a big one a few years ago. Landmines are killing almost all civilians, especially children, who are the most vulnerable, all over the world. They're the leftovers. When the Cold War was over and the U.S. and the Soviet Union pulled out of their proxy wars around the world, what they left behind were thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of anti-personnel landmines that keep on killing people for decades into the future. So the U.S. says, yes, we need a worldwide prohibition against landmines. Oh, but you don't expect us to sign on. We're the responsible nation. We don't use them like everybody else. Well, really. You know, this was the same thing with the International Criminal Court. We need an International Criminal Court. We need an opportunity to bring to justice these dictators around the world and those who would commit war crimes. But you don't expect us to sign on to it and make our soldiers vulnerable to such a court. We are the exception. So what you have, and it's an old story, you'll remember this, Saul, from ancient Rome and ancient Greece, right? When we used to read about that, the story that Thucydides wrote about, when he talked about the origins of the ancient Greek democracy. Now, ancient Greek democracy wasn't very democratic. It was democracy
of the few.
Democracy of the few. It was democracy if you were a man and not a woman, if you were rich and not poor, if you were free and not a slave. But okay, in those days there wasn't any democracy before that, so this was an advance, right? So a few people had democracy. So they create this fragile little democracy in Athens. And at one point the Athenians realized that they're kind of in jeopardy. Their country is sort of at risk. They need strategic depth. So they go to the island of Melos and they say, we need your island. And the Melians say, we don't think so. And the Athenians say, sorry, but we're taking your island. We're stronger than you. And the Melians come back and say, wait a minute, what about democracy? And the answer is, for us, there is democracy. For you, there is the law of empire. And I think that's very much what we're seeing right now. After 9/11, it's sharper than ever, that the law of empire means the Bush doctrine. You are either with us or you are with the terrorists and we will treat you as such. And what that means is not just you have to condemn the acts of what happened on September 11th. Everybody condemns that. But not everybody agrees on what to do about it. The U.S. view is the only thing to do about it is go to war. Lots of other people around the world and lots of governments in Europe, in the Middle East, all over the place said, that's not the way to stop this from happening again. We need something else. We need to treat this as a crime. We need cooperation on a global scale, not a global conflagration. And that's precisely what the U.S. refused to even talk about.
Well, I think, yes, I agree, Phyllis Bennis, that is exactly right. But I think it goes even further. It's not just double standards, I think, that we're talking about here. I think it's almost Alice in Wonderland. That is, if somebody would say to you, okay, which nation now has consistently violated human rights, invaded other nations' territory, ignored United Nations resolutions, amassed weapons of mass destruction, and refused to allow UN inspection teams?
That would be two. That would be the United States, every one of those things you just said, and the other, of course, would be Israel.
Yes, but who do they apply it to?
Well, that we go back to Iraq.
There we go.
Right.
So it's Alice in Wonderland.
Absolutely.
I say this applies to Iraq, and we don't talk about Israel.
Right. Israel, we don't talk about its nuclear weapons, which it has at least 200 high-density nuclear bombs, and has not signed on to any of the treaties that would allow inspection. The U.S., of course, recently walked out of the negotiations for the Germ Warfare Treaty for the exact same reasons that the Iraqis are about to be invaded again, potentially, according to the U.S., for refusing to allow in inspectors. That was the basis on which the U.S. refused to participate any longer in those negotiations, because they were not going to allow international inspectors into the United States to inspect U.S. Manufacturing capabilities that could make biological weapons that are prohibited by the treaty. So there's this extraordinary Alice in Wonderland phenomenon. As you say, this is an administration that acts like the Cheshire Cat. All they have to do is smile. All Bush thinks he has to do is say, I'm going to say howdy to the next world leader that I have to meet with, and I will bend him to my will. So you have Bush meeting with Putin and driving him around the ranch out in Crawford, Texas, and the next thing you know, Putin is agreeing to a new treaty, the abandonment of the ABM treaty, which has been the bulwark of nuclear disarmament efforts for years, or at least nonproliferation efforts, and agreeing to a new treaty which gave the U.S. everything it wanted, and all the Russians got out of it was a sort of face-saving arrangement that said that the treaty would have to be a formal signed treaty rather than just a handshake, which is what Bush originally wanted. All the other terms are precisely what the U.S. wanted. It's not because Bush is such a nice guy that he charms the pants off of everybody when they get to Crawford. It's because of the issue of power. And after September 11, what's really frightening is that there's not a government in the world that's prepared to stand up to the U.S. Before September 11, this is one thing that is different that I do talk about in my book. Before September 11, there was the beginning of some countries being willing to say, you know, this really isn't such a good idea that the U.S. has such untrammeled, unchallenged power. So the U.S. was kicked off the Human Rights Commission at the United Nations. That was a small step, but it was an important symbolic step. You had a number of countries that were outraged by the Bush administration's abandonment of the Kyoto Protocol on global warming, and they were saying so. They were saying global warming is a reality. It's a real threat. We have to take it seriously, and we're not going to accept this. You had the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, where the U.S. and Israel walked out because the conference was dead set on both dealing with the issue of reparations for former slaves and the issue of Israel's occupation of Palestine. The U.S. and Israel said, this is not acceptable. We don't accept that this has any legitimacy. We're out of here. And the rest of the world said, well, we're sorry you're leaving, but we're going to go ahead and do the work. Those were important steps. September 11 came along, and it was shut down. And that's, I think, one of the biggest differences and one of the most dangerous of this new period.
Yes, and I think in the South Africa conference, I think the delegates were careful even to note that anti-Semitism was a form of racism.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was language that was probably not particularly useful in some of the debates, as there often is in UN debates, but the language that was actually on the table for discussion was as moderate and cautious and careful as could be. For many, it was probably a little too cautious, but it was an effort to be as broad-minded and reach as broadly as possible. And this notion that the U.S. has enough power to not care about what the rest of the world thinks, it's a very dangerous tendency, not least because it engenders enormous antagonism towards us around the world. And one of the things that happens when you live in a country like we do, that is the strongest military power in the world, the strongest nuclear power, the strongest conventional power, the country that spends more on its military every year than the next 48 countries combined, we are then in a serious problem because when people get angry at what our government does, they can't lash out very easily. The U.S. is too strong and too powerful to lash out at the military. What do? They lash out at civilians. And that's where you get the danger of terrorism resulting from these kinds of policies.
You're listening to Phyllis Bennis on Hot Talk. This is Hot Talk from Cal Poly, the California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. It is also a transmission of WorldLink TV. I'm Saul Landau, your host on this weekly show where we take up the hot topics. And today, as I said, my guest in the studio from Amsterdam in the Netherlands is Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is also a fellow at the Transnational Institute and a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And I want to give a plug, the author of a book called Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's UN. And that book is available. And if you can't find it in your bookstore, go to one of the .coms. It's published by Interlink Publishing. Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's UN. And Phyllis, I also want to mention your new book, Before and After, U.S. Foreign Policy and the September 11th Crisis, which is coming out very shortly.
Just finished, and it's with the publisher now.
All right. Phyllis Bennis, Calling the Shots, How the United States Dominates Today's UN. Let's take up the subject that has been a boiling for some time now and is going to continue to boil. We're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about Israel, we're talking about Palestine. We have just seen Intifada number 2, an Israeli invasion of the Palestinian territory, an incredible spinning of the news, mostly certainly in the United States, in a very pro-Israeli fashion. Now, what is your take on first of all, let's go to the UN. Where are they in all of this?
Well, we have to be careful when we talk about the UN, what we're really talking about. The UN isn't really a they. The UN is a conglomeration of member states. The UN has a single voice, that's the voice of Kofi Annan, the Secretary General, and he said some very important things throughout this crisis. He said that Israel's invasion looked like a conventional war against the Palestinians. He said that Israel must end its illegal occupation. Those statements are very, very important when they come from someone with the stature of the Secretary General of the United Nations in general, but in particular this Secretary General, Kofi Annan, has made a name for himself in UN circles as being more pro-Israeli than any Secretary General before him. And so when he comes out with such sharp critiques of Israel as for their behavior in the Jenin refugee camp, where the Israelis simply refused to accept the UN team that had been requested by the Secretary General and decided on by the Security Council, and the U.S. clearly agreed to stand back and protect Israel from any repercussions from that rejectionism, it becomes very important to hear such a statement from Kofi Annan. But the reality is, right now, the issue has been bottled up in the Security Council. The U.S. veto of sending a protection force to the occupied territories, which every other country on the Security Council, 14 countries were prepared to vote for it. The U.S. said we're going to veto, and they imposed their veto. These are the kinds of unilateral actions by the United States that prevents the UN from taking the kind of action that was required. The same thing with Jenin. The vote was a very mild resolution calling for simply a fact-finding trip. Kofi Annan put together a very high-profile team of experienced UN officials and experienced international diplomats, and they were prepared to go to carry out that investigation. Only at that point did the Israelis begin to raise objections. First, they said, we don't like the composition, we don't like the mandate, we demand to vet every Israeli who they want to talk to. We must approve. Anyone who talks to the Commission must be granted immunity ahead of time from any potential war crimes prosecution. And finally, the United Nations said, we can't accept this kind of micromanaging by the suspect here in this investigation. And ultimately, the investigation was never sent at all. The next step was an important one because it sets a good precedent. The General Assembly then took up the issue where the United States has no veto. And the General Assembly decided to again request a report, an analysis by the Secretary General and the Secretariat staff of the events in Jenin. The big difference being they don't have the authority to vote to send a team regardless of Israel's wishes. The team will have to work based on existing reports from other organizations. But it's an important step because what it says is the General Assembly can do things when the Security Council is stalemated, is paralyzed. And the U.S. veto can paralyze the Security Council. The reality that we're dealing with is, I think, we can sum it up in one word: occupation. We forget in the United States because all we see in the media is the violence. At best, we see a kind of even recognition of both sides. And of course, the violence on both sides is horrific. The deaths on both sides are horrific. But if we're serious about ending the violence, we have to take seriously the causes of the violence. And I think that the Israeli peace group, Gush Shalom, which means peace bloc, I think they had it right. After the very first of the really horrific suicide bombings, the one at the pizzeria last summer, they issued a statement that said, the occupation is killing all of us. It's killing Palestinians, and now it's killing Israeli Jews. I think they had it right. If we're serious about stopping the suicide bombings, if we're serious about stopping the deaths on both sides, we have to be serious about stopping the occupation.
Well, I think I agree with you. I totally agree with you, and I think that it's interesting that Gush Shalom, which is an Israeli group that disagrees with the government, that publishes its disagreement, that stages rallies and protests in Israel, has the freedom and feels the freedom to do so. I know when I criticize the government of Israel's policy, and I'm sure when you do, I am hit usually with emails and phone calls saying I am a self-hating Jew, and some people have even called me an anti-Semite.
Right, I get the same ones, and I get death threats and all those things. And it's true that the press in Israel is far more diverse. The voices you can read in the Hebrew press, Haaretz, two of the reporters for Haaretz, Israeli Jewish reporters, Amira Haas and Gideon Levy, are two, Danny Rubenstein, a third, are some of the best reporters covering events inside the occupied territories. And they're writing only in the Israeli press. If they wrote in the New York Times, they wouldn't be allowed to say most of what they say day by day in the lead newspaper of Israel. So it's a terrible irony, and it goes back to the question of the role in the United States of the supporters of Israel, both the traditional Jewish supporters, which are grouped around organizations like the Council of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, which is perhaps the most influential in Congress. But recently, those traditional supporters of Israel, who often define their support for Israel, unfortunately, as uncritical endorsement of anything the current Israeli government does, no matter what it is, they've been joined by new supporters of Israel, who are the right-wing Christian fundamentalists, who have far more influence on the Bush administration. They tend to be Republicans, they're not Jewish, and they vote for the Bush people. So that's a lot of where the influence is coming from these days. And the irony, Saul, for people like you and me who are Jewish, there's a thoroughly anti-Semitic cast to this right-wing Christian support for Israel. And where it comes from is their view, as I understand the theology, their view is that the second coming of Christ can't happen until all the Jews are ingathered in Israel. So they not only support the state of Israel, but they support Zionism as a political project of bringing all the Jews together in the land that God gave them. The anti-Semitic part comes when you look at what's supposed to happen next. The next step, after all the Jews are there, is that before the second coming can happen, all the Jews will either convert or be killed. Mm-hmm. So it'll be the end of the Jews as the prerequisite for the second coming. Now, the Israeli officials who welcome their support don't talk about that part.
Well, I remember when Menachem Begin came to the United States, he gave Stars of David to some of these very people. And I asked a friend of mine, I said, I don't understand. These people are truly anti-Semitic. What does Begin have in common with them? And he said, well, Begin and they both believe that all Jews should be in Israel.
Right.
Albeit for different reasons.
Exactly. I mean, if we look at the anti-Semites in the U.S., they'd be delighted if all the Jews went off to Israel.
And there's the great story of one of the televangelists who used to say, of course, God doesn't hear the prayer of Jews, and you sure don't want to do business with those people. And a rabbi in Fort Worth, Texas, accused this televangelist of being an anti-Semite. And the televangelist took umbrage. He called his own press conference, and he said, I absolutely deny that charge. I am not an anti-Semite. One of the reporters says, what do you think an anti-Semite is then? He says, well, an anti-Semite, that's someone who hates Jews more than he's supposed to. Well, Phyllis Bennis, in the remaining 3 minutes, we are reading now constantly of the Bush administration's intention to wage war on Iraq, which has temporarily been sidetracked by essentially the war in Israel. Why does the United States, in your opinion, and from your studies, want to now go back and invade Iraq?
I think you hinted at the key reason when you said go back. A big part of the rationale has to do with history, has to do with the failure of Bush Sr. to have, quote, finished the war, and the sense of responsibility from Bush Jr. to finish Poppy's work. That's not the only reason, certainly. There is a huge level of political investment in the claim that we're going to get Saddam Hussein. This is a regime, a very brutal, repressive regime, no doubt, and it's one that has been brutal and repressive in the almost 30 years it's been in power, including in the decade of the 1980s when it was supported by the United States. The chemical weapons that were used, that we hear about constantly, a horrific use of an illegal weapon, were used with the help of U.S. targeters against Iranian troops, according to Newsweek magazine, who interviewed the Iraqi general who was responsible for firing the weapons with this illegal poison gas that also hit Iraqi civilians, Kurdish civilians in Halabja and elsewhere. So there's an enormous level of hypocrisy. A terrible regime, brutal as could be, whose brutality is ignored when it's fighting on the side that the U.S. wants it on, which is fighting against the Iranian regime after the overthrow of the Shah, and the U.S. then turns on it when it turns on Kuwait, when it invades Kuwait, again illegally. Suddenly the U.S. says this is a regime that is the equivalent of Hitler. So there's an enormous hypocrisy, an enormous refusal to take any responsibility for our role in creating this regime, keeping it in power. It now, after all these years of sanctions, all of the inspectors left Iraq saying Iraq no longer has the capacity for weapons of mass destruction. Whatever shreds, whatever dribbles they have left of chemical weapons is not enough to provide a serious threat to the United States or our allies. That it's simply, there's no evidence of it. What they're relying on is the demonization of all these years of Iraq to be enough to convince Americans that anything you do to Iraqis is okay because they're really all just like Saddam Hussein. Unfortunately, Iraq has 22 million people who are not Saddam Hussein.
Well, Phyllis Bennis, I really want to thank you for coming on Hot Talk, and I hope your words are heeded. I have a few doubts, but I hope they're heeded by the administration. Phyllis Bennis is a fellow at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam and a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And her new book is called Before and After, United States Foreign Policy and the September 11th Crisis. You've been listening to Hot Talk from Cal Poly, the California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. It is also a transmission of WorldLink TV. I'm Saul Landau, your host. I want to thank today's crew, Sonia Angulo and Farah Hassan. Tune in for more Hot Talk. Today we're coming to you from Amsterdam in the Netherlands.